All right, welcome. I'm gonna record in black and white today because the light is weird. That's why. Anyway, you can find a version of what I'm going to say on my medium.com site. I'll put that in the description, a link to that in the description in case you like reading stuff more. But this is basically a follow-up to a conversation I had with Daniel Tarpey on the topic of emergence and consciousness, and you can find those videos on either my or Daniel's channels. Preparing for that conversation. We cut it into two parts, but basically one conversation. Preparing for that conversation, having that conversation really helped me figure out my own views, or at least begin to develop my own views on emergence and consciousness as a possible emergent, right? And I wanted to take a moment to try to state my views more clearly than sometimes is possible when you're in dialogue with someone, having a conversation, doing back and forth. So here goes. First of all, what is emergence? This was, kind of the first part of our my and Daniel's conversation. What is emergence? So first of all, I would say forget all of those fancy concepts you may have heard about in connection with emergence. Forget about supervenience. Forget about downward causation. Forget about strong emergence. Forget about weak emergence. Forget about things like nomological dependence, whatever that is. I don't know what that is, but forget about it. Forget about causal dependence. Forget about types. Forget about tokens. Forget about unpredictability. Forget about non-deducibility. In my view, all those things are beside the point. They're obsolete. They're not useful concepts we're talking about very much at all. So let's simply say for now that emergence is the transformation of things through their interaction with other things. And fundamentally, I would say that the things interacting and undergoing transformation are processes. So already through reading things like Ernest Nagel's The Structure of Science, I was doubtful that unpredictability or non-deducibility were useful defining features of emergence. And if you want to figure out the difference between predictability and deducibility, good luck with that. As Nagel argued, anyway, what is deducible is theory dependent. This means that what is not deducible according to one theory may be deducible according to another theory, right? So theory dependent. On a related note, William James long ago criticized the method of inferring matters of fact from conceptual considerations, right? So getting matters of fact from thinking about concepts. To put it bluntly, I would say epistemology doesn't imply ontology. Deducibility and predictability are features of the state of our theories about the world, not features of the world we are theorizing about. So I reject David Chalmers's definitions of strong and weak emergence in his essay, well-known essay of that name. These definitions, I won't get into exact. Daniel kind of referenced them in the video. I won't get into kind of the details of that right now. But the definitions, which are based on non-deducibility and unexpectedness, use epistemological considerations to infer something about ontology. Again, whether something is deducible or not, or expected or not, is a feature of theories, not of the world, not a feature of the world as such. The world doesn't care whether we expect this or that to happen. If my friend acts in a way that's unexpected, it's unexpected to me, right? And maybe reveals a deficiency in my theory of my friend and my expectations regarding my friend. I maybe was wrong about him in some way. But to the friend himself or to another observer, the act may have been totally expected. So along with those kinds of epistemological criteria. When thinking about emergence, I also reject part-whole approaches, levels-based approaches, supervenience approaches, the concept of downward causation. I think the idea of a whole emerging from a combination of parts, which then supervenes on those parts and perhaps exerts a causal influence, downward causal influence on those parts. This comes, as far as I can tell, from a mechanistic orientation, but the kind of emergence you get from putting together a machine, which is indeed, maybe it's a good way to think about that, is indeed as a whole greater than the sum of its parts. This would be a special case of emergence. It's not kind of the typical case of emergence, or maybe not indicative of emergence generally. So the idea of, this idea of levels supervening on each other has too much of a dualistic flavor, for me. Instead, what would I like to do? What would I like to see? How would I like to think about emergence? I would align myself with the processual organizational approaches you find in pragmatism, as well as in the writings of people like Mark Bickard, Terence Deacon, Michael Silberstein, and others. Emergence in this view comes about when processes interact with and mutually transform each other. And this leads to new organizations, new properties, new behaviors, but it's the processes interacting. It's not parts getting combined into wholes. It's things interacting, transforming into new things, into new processes, instead of levels. We don't need to think about that in terms of levels, higher and lower levels. We can think of processes at different scales, right? Maybe smaller and more local, or smaller and more dispersed, or whatever. Larger clumps of things involving larger things, or more variety of interactions. So you can think of processes at different scales nested within each other. This is kind of the Deaconian way to put it. Or you could think about entangled systems and subsystems. This is the Silberstein way of talking about it, or one of his ways of talking about it. Or you could maybe think of tangled hierarchies. This is a phrase Bickard uses, which I think he borrows from Douglas Hofstadter. We can think more of a strange loop kind of way of thinking about it. Personally, I think Terence Deacon's distinction between homeodynamic, morphodynamic, and teleodynamic processes is especially helpful. It's possible, I think it's conceivable, that everything in the universe can be understood as emerging through the interaction of these three basic processes: homeodynamic, morphodynamic, teleodynamic. To oversimplify things, you can think of these processes as equilibrium tending towards equilibrium, pattern producing, or maybe survival seeking. This is simplifying. So the basic tendency of the universe seems to be equilibrium seeking, or homeodynamic. Things tend to become less ordered over time, tend to become more similar to their surroundings, right? Things kind of equalize with their surroundings unless work is done to maintain them. But when different equilibristic processes interact, the result is not always greater equilibrium. You can conceive of situations where equilibristic processes kind of enhance each other and drive things more quickly toward equilibrium, but that's not always the case. Some cases of interacting homeodynamic or equilibrium tending processes produce morphodynamic processes when they constrain each other or interact in certain kinds of ways that kind of conflict and constrain. They produce these morphodynamic or pattern kinds of situations. You can get these natural patterns, things like whirlpools, snowflakes, crystals, and all of that kind of thing. We're not at anything living yet, I would say, but we're at something patterned that's not just moving towards equilibrium. And then going on, when certain cases of interacting morphodynamic processes interact, they can produce teleodynamic, target-directed, survival-seeking processes. And these are the kinds of processes or self-preserving processes that mark life, that are part of what is definitional of life. And possibly everything from new stars to new societies can be explained in terms of complex interactions of homeodynamic, morphodynamic, and teleodynamic processes. At least that's something I think it's reasonable to hypothesize. Which is not to say, all this is not to say that the new thing is reducible to these processes. So the new thing is not just a combination of processes. It's only saying that historically the new thing was a product of the processes interacting with and transforming each other, right? But when processes interact, they cease to exist as independent processes. They mutually transform each other. So it's not correct to say that you can reduce a new thing to the component processes. There are no component processes anymore. They've been transformed into the, maybe sublated into the new thing. So what about consciousness? That's enough on emergence specifically. What about consciousness? Let me first say that I prefer to avoid the term consciousness as much as possible. This is not because I think there really is no consciousness, but because consciousness has several different distinct meanings depending on which philosophical or psychological system you're kind of in at the moment, which system you're considering at the time. So in order to be coherent, at least with other things I've said and written on this topic, I'll use the word experience to refer to consciousness in the widest sense. And there's other people who do this too, so I'm not totally out on a limb here. But by experience, I mean the sensory side of behavior, things like feeling, sensing, perceiving, imagining, remembering, kind of the sensory part of those as analytically distinct from the acts, from the behaviors that are guided by those things and bring them about, as I'm going to talk about later. Well, yeah, so let me get into that. So I use the word experience to emphasize the sensory side of sensory motor. You may have heard this term sensory motor in neurological, physiological discussions. So sensory motor is about the movement part, the behavior. Sensory is about the sensory. As I'll argue, however, this experiencing is always active. It's always within motor behavior, not as something added on, as something like added on top, but as integrated within it right from the very start. There is no ultimate distinction between behavior and experience, between doing and undergoing. The term sensory motor, I think, is apt because for organisms, the sensory always involves the motor and the motor always involves the sensory. So sensory motor. But before getting into this point in more detail, here's what I reject. Let me say what I reject in thinking about experience as emergent. All right, so here's what I maybe don't like. So I reject the hypothesis that experience is fundamental if that means that it emerged with the emergence of the universe itself, if it's taken as kind of like ontologically primary in the grand scheme of things. However, it seems reasonable to say that consciousness is a fundamental potentiality of the universe. I think consciousness did not exist in actuality at some point in time, and then at some point in time it did exist in actuality, or experience, I should say. And the fact of its later existence shows that it was potential or latent in what came before. Also, along with Dewey, I believe living organisms are continuous with inanimate matter. And if non-living matter was totally antithetical to, totally unlike living matter, then life would never have gotten started in the first place. And I agree with Dewey when he writes that effects, such as effects, since they mark the release of potentialities, are more adequate indications of the nature of nature than are just causes. So when you want to find out about nature, don't look at the causes of things, or don't only look at the causes of things, look at the effects. The effects are a better guide to potentiality. If you want to know the nature of nature, I would say just look around you at what it has produced, its effects. So for me, consciousness as actual is emergent, not fundamental, but emergent in what sense? What do we mean when we want to say that consciousness or experience is fundamental? So Daniel and I, in our conversation, joked around about the idea of me being a panpsychist. But I don't believe there are any versions of panpsychism that quite match my views. So the closest that I've been able to find so far is Philip Clayton's gradualist panpsychism. Clayton argues that basic non-living particles and chemical elements do not have consciousness, which I would agree with, while the first self-reproducing cells do have it in some manner, and I would agree with that. However, Clayton does bring in God at a certain point to complete his explanation, and I would avoid this move. This is, Clayton has an interesting paper that you can find on the web about panpsychism and panentheism. And so it's in the context of panentheism that he's laying out his argument for gradualist or emergentist panpsychism. I would agree with the kind of gradualist panpsychism part, not so much the panentheism part. I don't have any special reason to argue for panentheism or interest in arguing for it. But usually, so this is kind of not what most people think of when they think of panpsychism, though, right? So panpsychism is usually associated with the view that even elementary particles have some version of subjectivity. And I talked about some of these versions in the video in the conversation with Daniel. So for example, Galen Strawson, a leading panpsychist, argues that you simply can't get to experiential phenomena from non-experiential phenomena. He says that at least some physical ultimates, he says, must be intrinsically experiential, intrinsically experience involving. It's a quote from Galen Strawson. And this I disagree with. I would prefer to say, along with Dewey, that non-living elements show biases in how they interact with other non-living elements, and these biases were important for getting life started, but non-living elements don't care about the interactions they have. At least there's no good evidence to suppose that they care about having this interaction rather than that interaction. It would not, I think, be appropriate to say that a hydrogen atom wants to combine with an atom of oxygen rather than an atom of carbon. Hydrogen's bias toward one or another of these interactions can be better explained in other ways, in my view. So it doesn't care, no caring, no experience, in my theory. I believe you only get something that can be called wanting and caring and trying, things like that, and thus something in the neighborhood, at least, of experiencing when you get a living cell, the first living organism. Experience in actuality is fundamental, but only when life gets started. So it's an emergent, it becomes a fundamental part of at least our pocket of the universe after life emerges. And as I'll argue later, is bound up with that emergence of life. But I associate this view, the view I've just enunciated, not with panpsychism, but with Deweyan naturalism, and with the biosemiotics of people like Thomas Sebeok, or Sebeok, or however you say his name, Kalevi Kull, Terence Deacon, and other people in that world. The point being, I'm not a panpsychist as most people would define it. I'm also not a typical physicalist, although there's ways in which I'm physicalism friendly, I suppose. But a typical non-reductive physicalist, or anyone really who's, I would say, has been taken in by certain popularizers of neuroscience, would probably accept John Searle's declaration that, and here I'm going to quote John Searle, he declares that consciousness and other sorts of mental phenomena are caused by neurobiological processes in the brain, and they are realized in the structure of the brain. In a word, the conscious mind is caused by brain processes and is itself a higher level feature of the brain. This is what Searle argues. I find at least two problems here. So first of all, consciousness is seen by Searle as an effect or higher level feature of the brain. But what does this mean exactly? What sort of effect or feature is it? He obviously doesn't want to see it as immaterial, as an immaterial kind of thing in a dualistic sense. But then what exactly is it? Searle explicitly rejects dualism, but it's hard not to interpret this sort of thing about the brain, neurobiological processes producing consciousness. It's hard not to take that in a dualistic kind of sense, because then you're wondering, so what exactly is this consciousness that gets caused? So the other problem with this, maybe a bigger problem, well, a related problem anyway, is the inherent neurocentrism. So is the brain really all that's important? Obviously, in animals, the brain is important, but is that all we've cared about? After all, I've just argued that single-celled organisms have experience in some sense. But I think this view that the brain, you hear lots of people put it in terms like this. Lots of scientists of all different disciplines, they'll say that the brain generates consciousness, the brain produces thought, something like that. I think this is a form of the mereological fallacy, where you ascribe properties to a part of something that are really properties of a whole, a larger whole. Without getting too much into the weeds here, in my view, this neurocentrism has been devastatingly critiqued by many people, really, but I'll name drop psychologists and philosophers like Edmund Jacobson, F.J. McGuigan, Peter Hacker, the inactivists in philosophy of mind, and many, many others. The brain is important for animal consciousness, as I've already said. But even among animals, it's only one factor among many other factors. The view that the brain as such causes consciousness is, to me, as misguided as the view that consciousness goes all the way down to so-called ultimate particles. So I would see those as both kind of wrong-headed views, both kind of the standard non-reductive physicalist view and the standard panpsychist view. Dualism, moving on, dualism is also a non-starter for me. Most forms of emergentist dualism I've come across are very vague about how experience comes about. On David Chalmers's view of naturalistic dualism, how exactly do you get human subjectivity from dual aspect physical phenomenal information? That remains very unclear, to say the least. On William Hasker's view of emergentist dualism, which he explains in his book, The Emergent Self, on this view, how exactly does the brain generate what he thinks of as the immaterial field of consciousness? There is, I think I went into this a little bit in the conversation with Daniel, there is, I think, a kernel of truth in Hasker's field of consciousness view, Research into bioelectromagnetism shows that organisms do produce fields of various kinds, and these fields probably do play some role in what we call experience. At least they're important in various ways for the organism. But to identify any of these fields with experience, I think would be another form of the mereological fallacy. It's just as kind of narrow-minded as picking out the brain. The brain is what's important. It's all about the brain. These are both mereological fallacies. In any case, I feel that dualism, when you really try to figure out what it's saying, it just leaves us with more mysteries than when we started. So, how would I go about explaining the emergence of experience? I won't go into all the details here, but I'll give a sketch at least. For me, the basics were already put in place by early 20th century thinkers, people like John Dewey, George Herbert Mead, Edgar A. Singer Jr., E.B. Holt, Knight Dunlap, and others. Biosemioticians like Thomas Sebeok, Jesper Hoffmeyer, Kalevi Cole, Terence Deacon, and so on have maybe best developed this way of thinking at the present. Psychological physiologists like Edmund Jacobson, F.J. McGuigan have provided critical insights about the role of various bodily systems besides the brain in experience. So if you're really interested more in this viewpoint, there's a lot of stuff there you can read. But to put it simply, the organizations of materials that make life possible, the behaviors that keep it going, and the sensory perceptual experiencing that guides those behaviors, these are a necessary and integral unity. So the material organizations, the organic materials, the behaviors, the experiences, these are as one. You can't have life without behavior, and you can't have behavior without experience in at least some rudimentary sense. So we separate anatomy, we separate behavior and experience, we separate these things out for the purposes of special investigations. But in my view, it's a profound mistake to lose sight of the original unity of organic matter, behavior, experience. These are an originary unity. To put it another way, there is no hard problem of consciousness as David Chalmers formulated it. There is no problem of why consciousness exists. It exists because it's necessary for successful behavior, for adaptive behavior. And such behavior is necessary for the persistence of life itself. A living cell that could not do anything, that could not seek out and take in some bits of the environment and avoid other bits of the environment, this cell would not survive. And if there was no feedback to the cell, no sense or feeling about whether this or that bit of the environment was good or bad for it, its behavior would be pointless. Now, Chalmers would argue that this behavior that I'm talking about could go on in the dark, as it were. But this is to claim that one could live a successful life under general anesthetic. And this seems to me like an obvious absurdity. We do get kind of situations kind of like that in nature, things like congenital insensitivity to pain, but people with conditions like that are lucky if they survive to maturity. These are horrible things when you become insensitive to parts of your experience. Clearly, if you look into stuff like that, clearly pain and other forms of experience are deeply important for the continuance of life. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, one of the few organizations devoted to congenital insensitivity to pain is called something like the gift of pain. Pain really is a gift if you really think about how life works. We need to know when things are dangerous to us, when things are hurting our organism. Perhaps a good, and this is kind of parenthetically, perhaps a good working definition of life is that which is susceptible to anesthetic chemicals. And, consider that, and I'm quoting a paper here, a scientific paper here, that anesthetic drugs are effective in organisms ranging from paramecia to plants to primates. Paramecia are single-celled organisms. And point out that, of course, general anesthesia suppresses both behavior and experience, and even local anesthesia blocks out part of your experience, but it degrades behavior in that part of your body. So to me, this is makes just obvious the idea that experience and behavior are a unity, and you can't have one without the other. So there's no hard why question about experience, but there are interesting and complex questions about how experience is conditioned by various organismic structures and processes and environments. So the conditions for experience are interesting and complex. They're hard in a sense, but I think they're hard in a technical sense. We know quite a lot about it. It's quite complicated if you study something like how vision works or how olfaction works. There's a lot of stuff we don't quite understand, or the things that are controversial, but we do know quite a lot. And we do know quite a lot about how the environment impacts our experience. We should expect, for instance, that experience for creatures with eyesight is different from experience for creatures without eyesight. This is one condition of experience, right? What organs you have. There's no mystery, I think, in the fact that organisms with different organs and different behavioral possibilities should experience the world differently. I mean, that just seems a reasonable supposition, which can be tested and has been tested. And we have, you can't get inside the mind of other animals, and it's arguable about whether you can get inside the mind or what that would mean with human beings, but you can get a pretty good sense of what their possibilities of experience are. So if experience is of a piece with the living process itself, as I've argued, then the only relevant hard problem is the problem of the emergence of life. And this question seems to get more tractable by the year. Personally, I lean on the work of Terence Deacon and his colleagues, and Nick Lane and his colleagues, but there are other viable hypotheses out there about the origin of life, and I've heard, I couldn't find exact quotes, but I've seen in video conversations or podcast conversations where other philosophers who think consciousness is a big mystery admit that the origin of life is less of a mystery, where it's more of a, as they say, more of an engineering problem now and less of a metaphysical problem, yet they still want to hold on to this idea of consciousness as a grand, impenetrable mystery. And I think that, in my view, that doesn't make sense. Once you've explained life, you've explained what you need to explain about consciousness, at least the basics. So what really seems to trip people up in making sense of experience is this modern human sense. I think it's a very human sense of having an inner subjective world. I don't think most people find it mysterious that we should see and hear and smell what's going on around us in our immediate environment. That seems kind of natural. How could we survive if we weren't aware of our immediate environments? But why should we be able to see and hear and even smell things that are not in what we take to be our real life practical surroundings? So I can sit in my little office surrounded by apparently real books and papers and pens and coffee cups, while in my inner world, I'm in some tropical paradise I've never actually seen, doing things I've never actually done, or maybe reliving with who knows what accuracy some past episode of triumph or humiliation, as I think many people often do, including me. So how could this seemingly autonomous inner world of thought and memory and imagination be of the same stuff as the unforgiving practical outer world, not to mention of the same stuff as this bag of meat and mucus and gas that we call a human body, not to get too graphic. Is there not then some fundamentally mysterious mind or soul floating around somewhere inside of me or above me, which is my true self? Now, I think that the mystery of this inner world is deflated or begins to be deflated when you realize that it's simply a transformation of normal perceptual and verbal behaviors. Without, again, getting into too much details, which I'll try to expand on elsewhere, humans evolved a sort of anatomy and physiology that allows them to act in overt public ways as well as to act in subtle, private ways. By acting in overt ways, you can talk to the people around you. By acting in very small ways, you can talk to just yourself. By acting with respect to the world around you, you can come to perceive it. We perceive through behaving again. And by later acting in similar ways, but on a reduced scale, you can perceive that world when it is absent. Say when you close your eyes, or when you move to a different location, you can re-experience that world by acting in a similar way as you acted when you were present in that world. And further, by manipulating your public behaviors, say by walking around or standing on your head, you can come to perceive the external world in new ways. And in a similar way, by manipulating your small-scale private behaviors, you can come to perceive things that even do not have a real-world existence. And I should add, maybe parenthetically, that this behavior of perceiving objects in their absence, as B.F. Skinner termed it, this perceiving of objects that are absent hijacks your sense organs. This is why you can't normally clearly perceive external objects and absent objects at the same time. The more distinctly, in general, the more distinctly you perceive the absent object, the less distinctly you perceive the present object. On the other hand, it does seem that the ingesting of, taking in certain substances and even some neurobehavioral disorders do allow you to more freely combine present and absent objects into a unified experience. This is an interesting phenomenon, but I'll leave that aside for now. An important point, though, is that when we act in these subtle or covert ways, kind of these ways that are hidden from other people, the behavioral element often becomes invisible also to us. When we daydream of a vacation in a tropical paradise, we often don't notice that this daydream is a muscular behavior. In this way, we have the illusion of a kind of autonomous mind, separate from the body. And if there's a sense in which illusionism about consciousness is true, I would say maybe it is this, the illusion that we can have an experience, as in the experience of a private inner world, without acting. Right? I think this is an illusion that we don't notice our behaviors, or we stop noticing our behaviors, or never learn how to notice those behaviors that we engage in when we are imagining, dreaming, all of that. But the experiments of physiological psychologists like Jacobson and McGuigan, who I've already mentioned a couple of times, these demonstrate that the body is just as involved in experiencing the inner world as it is in experiencing the outer world. In fact, you can train yourself to be sensitive to your body's behaviors when you, say, wonder whether you left the stove on, or fantasize about getting it on with that good-looking member of whatever gender or perhaps species you prefer. Be inclusive. There's more to say here, of course, but let me reiterate that, in my view, experience, or quote-unquote consciousness, is an integral aspect or property of life itself, such that once you have explained life, you have explained experience. Life itself is an emergent effect of interacting morphodynamic or pattern-producing chemical processes. At least that's my argument at the moment. The maintenance of this interaction over space and time requires the simultaneous emergence of behavior. And the emergence of successful behavior or adaptive behavior requires, as part of it, the simultaneous emergence of experience. So that's where I'm going to end. Thank you for listening, and have any questions or comments, please let me know. See ya.